The people have long been divided into two factions, as I explained in an earlier volume. Justinian attached himself to one of them, the Blues, to whom he had already given enthusiastic support, and so contrived to produce universal chaos. By doing so, he brought the Roman state to its knees. However, not all the Blues were prepared to follow the lead of Justinian, but only the militant partisans. Yet even these, as things went from bad to worse, appeared to be the most self-disciplined of men, for the license given them went far beyond the misdemeanors which they actually committed. Needless to say, the green partisans did not stay quiet either. They too pursued an uninterrupted career of crime, as far as they were permitted, although at every moment one or other was paying the penalty. As a result, they were constantly provoked to commit crimes far more audacious still, for when people are unfairly treated, they naturally turn to desperate courses. So now that he was fanning the flames and openly spurring on the Blues, the entire Roman Empire was shaken to the foundations. As if an earthquake or a cataclysm had struck it, or as if every city had fallen to the enemy. For everywhere there was utter chaos, and nothing was ever the same again. In the confusion that followed, the laws and the orderly structure of the state were turned upside down. To begin with, the partisans changed the style of their hair to a quite novel fashion, having it cut differently from the other Romans. They did not touch mustache or beard at all, but they were always anxious to let them grow as long as possible, like the Persians. But the hair on the front of the head they cut right back to the temples, allowing the growth behind to hang down to its full length in a disorderly mass, like the Massagetai. That is why they sometimes call this the Hunnish style. Then, as regards dress, they all thought it necessary to be luxuriously turned out, donning attire too ostentatious for their particular station. For they were in a position to obtain such garments at other people's expense. The part of the tunic covering their arms was drawn in very tight at the wrists, while from there to the shoulders it spread out to an enormous width. Whenever they waved their arms as they shouted in the theater or the hippodrome and encouraged their favorites in the usual way, up in the air went this part of their tunics, giving silly people the notion that their bodies were so splendidly sturdy that they had to be covered with garments of this kind. They did not realize that the transparency and emptiness of their attire rather served to show up their miserable physique. Their capes and breeches too, and in most cases, their shoes were classed as Hunnish in name and fashion. At first, the great majority carried weapons at night quite openly, while in the daytime they concealed short two-edged swords along their thighs under their cloaks. They used to collect in gangs at nightfall and rob members of the upper class in the hall forum or in narrow lanes, despoiling any they met of cloaks, belts, gold brooches, and anything else they had with them. Some they thought it better to murder as well as rob, since dead men told no tales. These outrages caused universal indignation, especially in those Blues who were not militant partisans, since they suffered as badly as the rest. Consequently, from then on, most people wore belts and brooches of bronze, and cloaks of much poorer quality than their station warranted, for fear that their love of the beautiful would cost them their lives. And even before sunset, they hurried back home and got under cover. As this shocking state of affairs continued, and no notice was taken of the offenders by the authorities in charge of a city, The audacity of these men increased by leaps and bounds. For when nothing is done to discourage wrongdoing, there is of course no limit to its growth. Even when punishment does follow offenses, it does not often put an end to them altogether. It is natural for most people to turn easily to wrongdoing. That is how things went with the Blues. Of their opponents, some came over their faction through a desire to join in their criminal activities without paying any penalty. Others took to flight and slipped away to other countries. Many who were caught in the city were put out of the way by their opponents or executed by the authorities. Many other young men poured into this organization. They had never before shown any interest in such things, but ambition for power and unrestrained license attracted them to it. For there is not one revolting crime known to men which was not at that time committed and left unpunished. They began by destroying the partisans of the opposite faction, then went on to murder those who had given them no excuse whatever. Many also won them with bribes, then informed against their own enemies. These the partisans got rid of at once, labeling them Greens, though they knew nothing at all about them. All this went on no longer in darkness or out of sight, but at any moment of the day and in every part of the city, and the most eminent citizens, as often as not, were eyewitnesses of what was happening. There was no need to keep the crimes concealed, since the criminals were not troubled by any fear of punishment. In fact, they were actually moved by a spirit of rivalry, so that they organized displays of brawn and toughness to show that, with a single blow, they could kill anyone they met unarmed. And no one now could expect to live much longer amid the dangers that daily threatened him. Constant fear made everyone suspect that death was just round the corner. No place seemed safe. No time could guarantee security, since even in the most revered churches and at public festivals, people were being senselessly murdered, and confidence in kith and kin was a thing of the past. For many perished through the machinations of their nearest relatives. No inquiry, however, was held into the crimes committed. The blow invariably fell without warning, and the fallen had no one to avenge them. Nor law or contract retained any force on the secure basis of established order. But everything turned to growing violence and confusion, and the government was indistinguishable from a tyranny. Not, however, a stable tyranny, but one that changed every day and was forever starting afresh. The decisions of the magistrates suggested the paralysis of fear. Their minds were dominated by dread of a single man, while juries, when settling questions in dispute, based their verdicts not on their notions of what was just and lawful, but on the relations, hostile or friendly, which each of the disputants had with the partisans. For any juror who disregarded their injunctions would pay the penalty with his life. Many creditors were under irresistible pressure to return the written agreements to their debtors without recovering a penny of the debt, and many people, to their chagrin, had to free their domestic servants, and it is said that a number of women were forced by their own slaves to yield to many suggestions most repugnant to them. And by now, the sons of men in high positions, after associating with these young criminals, compelled their fathers to do a number of things they were most reluctant to do, and particularly to hand over their money to them. Many unwilling boys, with the full knowledge of their fathers, were forced into immoral relations with the partisans, and women who were happily married suffered the same humiliation. It is said that one woman, very elegantly attired, was sailing with her husband to one of the suburbs on the mainland opposite, and during this crossing, the partisans intercepted them, tore the lady from her husband's arm, and carried her to their own boat. Before going on board with the young men, she whispered encouragement to her husband and told him to have no fear on her account. She would never submit to physical outrage. Then, while her husband was still watching her through his tears, she jumped overboard, and from that moment was never seen again.